Sam, you've made it through the Valley of Darkness, and in front of you are two doors, one on your left and one on your right. There is a window in each door. Through the window in the door on the left, you can see a land that promises wealth and prosperity for all, but there is a limit to how many resources you can hoard. Whereas the door on the right shows demons torturing people for all eternity, but the demons say that with gumption, maybe you can become one of them. Which door do you pick?
I don't know. I mean, horns and a pitchfork are quite appealing.
Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we analyse protests, revolutions, and talk all about how to fight the good fight. My name's Adam, and with me, as always, is a man who did not invite me to his wedding. How are you doing, Sam?
In fairness, no one was invited to my wedding because it was during COVID lockdowns. The sun is out,
Excellent.
But that does not mean that times are good. Listeners will hear the first few episodes of this preseason that we recorded some time ago now, but those episodes were recorded before Donald Trump took office for the second time, and we alluded to how bad we thought it could be, but I couldn't even imagine the reality that I'm currently living in here in the United States, so I'll just leave it at that.
That's a rough one, and well, I guess we keep doing what we can. We also had some sunshine here in Amsterdam today, so that was nice. But I was at work, so I was indoors, so I didn't get to be out in it. Not quite the same level of despair, but kind of a bummer.
Well, as we know, if you're European, your mood is totally dependent on that yellow ball in the sky.
It is, especially up here in the north. That's why the south has so much fun. Before we get started, some congratulations are in order. We are celebrating an Independence Day, as we like to do every episode. And this day, not independence from Britain or independence from France, but independence from the Ottoman Empire. Congratulations to Bulgaria. The 3rd of March is Liberation Day, when independence is celebrated following the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. Congratulations, comrades.
Congratulations, Bulgaria. No notes.
So, in this episode, the last one of the pre-season, we're going to be talking all about the left. What the left is, why we speak from leftist perspectives, and why we believe the solutions to the problems of our time are found in a stronger left. We're going to go through some definitions, some examples of socialist successes, some counter-arguments to common anti-socialist talking points, and how a left-wing perspective fits in with ideas around revolution and protest. But to start us off, I thought it would be good to talk in a very free-form way. I don't have any notes, just about our own journeys to the left. Why we both picked that door on the left there. So Sam, why are you a leftist?
Yeah, I think I've got a bit to say on this point because, like a lot of leftists, my road here has been very long and complicated, and I still hope to learn every day and grow with every day that I live. I don't come from a conservative household, maybe on a global scale, but not in an American sense, but I ended up in very conservative circles during my formative years, like late high school, in search of meaning and community, which, to be honest, I think is how most conservatives in America end up with that mindset, is because the suburbs in America are so isolating and you take community where you can find it. And for me, this came in the form of church community. And I even went to the March for Life in San Francisco in 2013, which for those that don't know is a huge anti-abortion march. I was very deep into this world. In 2015, a man named Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy for president of the US. And for one reason or another, I started to hear some of his messaging through social media. And what he was saying started to make a bit of sense to me. These were things I'd never thought twice about, but really clicked. Things like, in the richest nation in the history of the world, why do people have medical or student debt? Or why does the top 1% own over 50% of the wealth? And even being a little conservative teenager, I was like, why is this the case? Why is the wealth not felt in America, yet we are so rich and powerful? And in the autumn of that year, I did a study abroad semester where I went with an open mind to learn about life in the UK and Europe as a whole. But I did very much embark on this journey as an American exceptionalist, as is the default for every American. There, I met the guy that I'm speaking to right now, Mr. Adam.
Hello.
And overall, I had an amazing time. And I was honestly pretty baffled by how good life felt over there in London. This was before Brexit, by the way. When I returned to the US, Donald Trump had begun his conversion of many Republican voters, including most people in the church circles that I ran in. And I saw a clear hypocrisy and extreme contradiction between this man and the teachings of Jesus. I knew this wasn't the place for me anymore, as it was becoming this nest of hatred in the rhetoric and us versus them, a lot of victim mentality. So it took a while to completely leave this community. I had certain ties. I was playing in a band that would go and play at different churches and retreats and stuff. But at this point, I was attending Bernie Sanders rallies. I attended his one in Vista, California at the time. And I would call myself a clear Democratic Party liberal at that point. However, as time went on, I began to learn more about politics and the politics of the wider world specifically, not just in America. And I saw the ineffectiveness of the American Democratic Party in combating the populist right-wing agenda in the US. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, I eventually moved to Hong Kong. And while I was there and experiencing the protest movement there, I was firmly in line with the ideals of this protest movement, which were very classical liberal in nature, very idealistic. But I think my true radicalization has come only in the last 3 or 4 years. I saw how poorly the neoliberal governments of the West handled the COVID crisis and realized through some of my more environmentally conscious friends like Adam over here that neoliberalism will never be able to combat even larger crisis like the climate crisis. But finally, I think the final nail in the coffin to radicalizing me every single day is just living here in America and working in the corporate world here. Problems just compound on my brain, and leftism presents the ways to solve these problems. Just in my own life in the last few years, we've battled insane medical bills for the tiniest of doctor's visits. We've paid a huge percentage of our income to rent with some of the largest property owners in California, and dealt with a lack of community and public transportation options that come with living in an American suburb. So every day makes me want to don that hammer and sickle and break something even more.
That's quite a journey you've been on, and I've seen a lot of it. We met when you went to London, and I have seen your sort of radicalization develop over the years. And I think that is a journey that is not uncommon. You know, I think that a lot of people kind of start out that way and reach the same conclusions as you, having observed all of the contradictions which are so apparent in our society.
Yeah, and I think my journey, maybe I do stray from this from time to time, but I would advise against judging some of the people you see that are clearly infuriating, like at an anti-abortion rally or who are pro-Trump on social media. I think a lot of these people are misguided and just didn't meet the right people that I met. And if I had lived in different circumstances and not done some of the things I had done, then I'd be right there with them still, probably. Who's to say, really, though? But I think my point is just that anyone can change. There is a capacity. Just as there is a capacity for people to go from left to extreme right when you give them $1 billion Spotify deal, I guess.
That'll happen. It is funny how much the left-right shift is tied to just people suddenly becoming very wealthy.
How about you? What was your journey to this point? I think as it stands, and why Adam is leading this episode instead of me, is because I think he's been firmly more in this leftist identity longer than I have, and has done a bit more reading on it than me as well.
That's probably true. I've always been left of centre for really as long as I can remember. There are some key moments that I look back upon from childhood even. I remember one of them when I was maybe 8 or 9, and I went to a tiny, tiny school. It was reception to year 4, so that's pre-K to 3rd grade for any American listeners. And there were 120 kids in the whole school across these 5 grade levels. And we were doing a student council thing. And it wasn't like a real student council. It was more just, about how to vote on stuff and have meetings and whatnot. And when we were doing this, I remember my teacher said to the teaching assistant, "Which party do you think Adam would be a member of, Labour or the Conservatives?" And she said Labour, and they both laughed. And I did not understand the significance of that until many years later. Continuing, until relatively recently, I still maintained some of these contradictions in my mind. I think for a long time, I was hopeful that Western states were on a progressive path in the long term. I think I was hopeful that tech could be an emancipatory force, and of course it can, but I thought that social media as it existed back in 2012, 13, 14 was an emancipatory force. The final nail in the coffin of my radicalization was reading Vincent Bevan's book, The Jakarta Method, which outlined Washington's anti-communist intervention in Indonesia following the Second World War, which I hadn't heard of before reading this book because it was wildly successful. 1 million people were killed in US-backed anti-communist murders in Indonesia. That leads us to where we are today. I've just become more radical over the years, and I'm pretty happy with that, to be honest. It's something that I feel very confident in, my worldview. I am not worried about disagreements with people about it because I have done, I think, a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of thinking, and come to the conclusions that I hold.
I think as time goes on under the Trump presidency, round 2 over here, at least over here, I think in Europe, there can be similar things applied. But as neoliberalism fails more and more people, they will be turning to alternative methods of organizing. And I think that's why we're here, is to provide a voice for people that maybe don't know what comes next. And maybe we can steer them clear of the reactionary take. I know a lot of people that really believe in neoliberalism over here, and they're in shambles right now. They can't believe what Donald Trump is doing to the Constitution, to the institutions, and I mean, I'm seeing it in real time. Some of them turning towards, okay, well, maybe he's right, and other ones, knowing my stance on politics, asking me, okay, well, what's the solution here in your view? I'm seeing it crumble before my eyes in the course of about a month, by the way. So who knows what 4 years will bring.
Who knows? But we've sort of gotten ahead of ourselves through this conversation. I think it's really nice to set the scene with our own journeys, but we were throwing around a lot of terminology there that is quite special, like neoliberalism, socialism, capitalism. These are all terms that people hear all the time, but it can be hard to get a grip on. So in a moment, we're going to go to that. But I want to set the stage a little bit by pointing out, as you have just observed, we are living currently, the current problems that we see around us are the direct consequence of decades of neoliberalism. Donald Trump is not a cause of the problems that we see around us. He is a symptom. He is the natural progression of an order that has been in place since at least the 1970s and arguably a lot longer. And throughout the US, much of Europe, many parts of the world, we are seeing a resurgence of fascism. Liberalism is not a viable alternative to fascism. Liberalism cannot defeat fascism. Only socialism can do that. And I'm using the term socialism very broadly there, but we'll get into some more specific definitions now. I want to start out by saying the way in which socialism is the only viable alternative to fascism by talking about two theories that you might have seen online, or indeed just heard about. There is the horseshoe theory and the fishhook theory. Are you familiar with these two theories, Sam?
I'm familiar with neither of these. Enlighten me.
Okay, so the horseshoe theory, this is something that I remember hearing about very young, maybe, younger than 10 for sure.
I'm American.
I think you will have heard of it when I say what it is.
Okay.
Horseshoe theory is the idea that the political spectrum, the left-right political spectrum that we're familiar with, is not a straight line going from left to right. It is a horseshoe. So the extremes of the left and the extremes of the right are much closer together than this sort of golden mean, which inevitably is described as sort of a classic Western liberal state that maybe existed 2001 to 2008 or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's the idea. Have you heard that before? Have people said similar things to you?
I haven't heard the term horseshoe theory to describe it, but I have heard political ideologies described that way.
Yeah. Well, fishhook theory is a more recent response to that, which argues that the shape of the political spectrum is not like a horseshoe, it's like a fishhook. So centrists are much closer to the reactionary right than the left, because it goes out in a straight line and then curves back around on itself. You might have heard the quote, "Scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds."
Yeah, I have heard that one.
I think a really interesting example of that has been certainly doing the rounds on social media, at least within my algorithm, are the response of Kamala Harris voters towards Palestine after the election of Donald Trump, where they are saying, you voted for Donald Trump, therefore I hope Palestine burns to the ground. Things like that.
Yeah. I've been seeing a lot of Democrat liberals blaming the pro-Palestine crowd that abstained or that voted for Trump, which I didn't agree with that move, but people can vote how they want. And if you actually look at the numbers, they didn't make a life-changing percentage point to this vote. Like, that's just a scapegoat again. So sure. I see what you're alluding to here.
For sure. Many people have been conditioned over the years to fear or to misunderstand socialism, which people might be skeptical hearing that the far left is much further away from the far right than the center is. And so we're going to help that out by going through a few definitions here. So maybe we start out by saying, what is capitalism? What is capitalism, Sam?
I think this actually confuses some people. People will think that everything we do now in terms of commerce and interaction with money is capitalism. But that's not the case. Commerce is just the transactionary nature between buying a good or trading a good for another, whereas capitalism is owning the means of production and earning your income off of other people's labor. So this really began at the start of the modern era with companies like the British East India Company, where banks and nobles were investing their funds into these enterprises in the colonies, and the labor of other people in the colonies, extracting the raw goods, but also in the factories back home, led to an increased profit of their initial investment. In today's day and age, we see that most people strive to become a capitalist. They want to, quote, make their money work for them. But that's false. Money doesn't work for you. Other people work for you. They just want other people's labor to benefit them. That comes in the form of property ownership. When you people are paying rent to you, that's part of their income that's now yours. Funding new companies where you can be the owner and you can make a huge percentage of profit off of other people's work. That is capitalism, is when you can invest your money and make more off of it from other people's work.
I think that's a good definition. And interesting you mentioned the British East India Company, because I work as a tour guide in part. And one of the stops in central Amsterdam is a little square called Beursplein, next to Beurs van Berlage, the old stock exchange in Amsterdam, which is the actual birthplace of capitalism itself. 1602, the establishment of the Dutch East India Company, the world's first ever shareholder-owned company.
Nice.
And capitalism, in the simplest terms, is defined by the private ownership of the means of production. So that means that private individuals own factories, for example, factories being the easiest example there.
Yeah.
But it is also defined sort of more broadly by a certain logic. Jason Hickel, who's an anthropologist who's written a lot about degrowth, gives the example of like a family-run restaurant, and they will make about the same amount of profit each year, and it's enough for them to live off and go on holiday once or twice a year, something like that. He argues there's nothing particularly capitalist about that, even though it is individuals who have owned this productive force, this restaurant. What's capitalist is the accumulation of capital, that is basically money or resources that can make money, as a goal in and of itself. So whereas in the family-run restaurant, the point is to make enough money to survive and have a decent quality of life, in a really capitalist system, the point is to make more money, to accumulate more capital, to expand, to grow, etc. Which is part of what you say, right? You own these things, you get money as a return on your investment, but that requires growth. That's capitalism. And importantly, there is a difference between private property and personal property. Your personal property is the things that you own. It's your laptop, your phone, your bed, whatever. Private property refers to productive things like factories, like office buildings, companies, etc. So that's capitalism in a nutshell. On the left, we have many more different ideas of how to either counter, destroy, combat, tame capitalism, and they can have some scary words. And we're going to go through and try and define them all. So, we have liberalism, social democracy, democratic socialism, socialism in a very broad sense, communism, and anarchism. There's other variations of these, but these are some good ones to get started with. And I'm going to put you on the spot for all of them. So, Sam, what is liberalism?
Liberalism is very much in line with that capitalist definition we said, but I think what separates, right-wing capitalist from a liberal capitalist would be more social conditions within society. They don't want to dismantle the exploitation of workers, but they do want everyone to be able to vote, and they do want everyone to not be bullied in the online spaces. And liberal ideologies go back, I think, to the Enlightenment, which we've discussed. It's the individual freedoms to go pursue your endeavors.
When you talk about a liberal in the contemporary sense, then you're talking about someone who might have some progressive social ideas, as you say, gay marriage or whatever. They're all for that, but ultimately they think that capitalism is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Social democracy.
Now, this one, I think we may have seen the heyday of. It might be behind us, but that is sort of what happens in Scandinavia. This is where a lot of socialist policies are implemented, but capitalism still largely runs the system overall. So in places like Norway, they've used their oil reserves to subsidize education and healthcare for their people. Now, at the end of the day, free trade still reigns, and there's just a bit more of a social safety net on society.
Yeah, democratic socialism.
This one's a bit trickier for me to define. I think of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn in the US and UK respectively. And I think this is more used in a transition of an ideal that they would like to get to. It's let's maintain our democratic organization, but use that democratic power to implement socialist safety nets, such as the things I just mentioned, education, healthcare, those types of things.
Yeah, this gets a little blurry. I think that what's key about democratic socialism is the nationalization of key industries, healthcare, transit, energy, maybe things like steel production, stuff like that, like critical infrastructure, strong union representation. You have that in social democracy as well, but really a more key part of the political decision-making process, but still with the private ownership of property.
And so that brings to socialism broadly. When someone just calls you a socialist, what is that in your mind?
Well, I use the term socialism very broadly. I use it as kind of a blanket term for all of the various sort of leftist leanings that I have. But really, socialism defines a transitional state between capitalism and communism. Marx, he believed that communism was a classless, moneyless society where the state will fade away and everything is owned in common. And socialism is the state that we have to transition between capitalism and communism. Socialism is defined by workers owning the means of production. Think all businesses are cooperatives, basically. Again, with the nationalization of key industries, broad welfare state, things like that. Strong democratic representation within that.
Okay. So then you've kind of defined communism as well with that a bit. Like, what would be the ultimate goal then in a communist society?
So the ultimate goal in a communist society is to see the state fade away. Like, the ultimate form of communism is anarchism, and we'll talk a little bit about anarchism in literally a moment. But the idea is that things are owned in common to such an extent, and the systems have been built in such an extent that people have direct democratic control over all of the resources in their area. This is true globally, and through this sort of communal allocation of resources, the need for a state entirely disappears, and the need for money entirely disappears because people just are given what they need. Summed up by the sort of Marxist slogan, from each according to his need, to each according to his ability. If the idea is, if that runs perfectly, you don't need money, you don't need a state.
Okay, so you mentioned anarchism, and that's just, is that final point?
In a sense, yes. Like, anarcho-communism is the kind of final stage of communism where the state doesn't exist. Where anarchism kind of differs from socialism is there's a historical sense in how it differs from socialism, in that anarchists were killed in the early days of the USSR, for example. But it's also to do with the means by which socialists and anarchists attempt to achieve the revolution and what they hope the aims of it are. Anarchism is about trying to dismantle all hierarchy. And so, whereas a socialist might want to harness state power, seize state power and harness it for their own means, anarchism wants to entirely destroy that power. So what that means in a practical sense is that whereas socialists might be led by a sort of vanguard party this is what happened in the Soviet Union, where you have a group of committed professionals who work together to seize the central apparatus of the state. Anarchists want to create these liberated zones where you weaken the power of state in your local area, remove the need for them there, these sort of capitalist structures. And through creating these liberated zones and sort of linking them up, then we create this anarchist society.
Okay. I think it's important to note that this isn't necessarily what every leftist is trying to achieve, right? I think there's a point where on this progression where most might want to stop at a certain point. Some people might want a strong central government and they wouldn't want anarchism later on. Yeah,
for sure. And there's going to be disagreements, This is one of the great difficulties of the left, is that we are progressive, so we want to move society forward, bring about better times. And so, because no one can predict the future, there's going to be disagreements about how that should happen. So, why do these definitions matter? And I think a way of unpacking that is trying to think, do you remember what you thought about these terms when you were in school? Maybe it can be hard once you're really in it, but what were you told about socialism, about communism when you were at school?
I grew up in America, so it was very vilified, and the Soviet Union was clearly depicted as the enemy during history lessons, and likewise all the other socialist states as well, like China later on and Vietnam. And the motifs of these countries were, they are kind of easy to vilify, right? Because they're very brutalist in their design. I think when you contrast that with American culture of the time, which is very, bright and colorful, it can seem to a kid like, yeah, they're the enemy, clearly.
It's also important to remember that these sort of brutalist designs, when we were growing up, there were these big monuments which were terrifying, and are terrifying, but Soviet or Eastern Bloc apartment buildings, if they have a lick of paint, they actually look really nice. Like, a lot of them just need a bit of work. But exactly, so I think that, these definitions can be so easily muddied in the contemporary media, online spaces. People use these terms disingenuously. Maybe they don't know what they mean at all, but they've heard it, so they throw it around. And so understanding what these terms mean and what people are actually advocating for when they self-identify as these labels can help push back against misinformation. But these are quite disparate things. What do you think is the thing that links all of these, Sam?
The thing that links all of them together, maybe apart from liberalism that we've included in there, is that they see that the organization of society today is wrong, that it can be done in a better way that benefits the most people possible. And I think fascism and I think liberalism both tend to normalize the exclusion of certain groups and justify the hardship that some people face. Whereas these left-wing ideas see the hardship people face as a result of society, not the result of the person, and tries to uplift the most people possible.
I think that's true. I think that especially with an American lens, there is a real focus on the individual versus the community, right? The idea on the right is that you just got to work hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and then you can achieve anything. And this is taking, I think, a good faith understanding of a conservative argument. I think there are plenty of conservatives and people on the left as well, for sure, but perhaps more so in conservatism, who have bad faith arguments for what it is. But if you're a good faith conservative, then I think what you believe is that in the event that the conditions are created where people can help themselves, then that will create a more just, wealthy society. And I think that that is true. I just think that we radically disagree on what those conditions are.
Right.
Maybe we can dispel directly some common misconceptions about socialism and communism. And to start that out, I have two quotes that I would like you to read.
The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. Margaret Thatcher. And the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. Winston Churchill.
I think that this really sums up the broad panning of socialism, at least in a European context.
The most common brushstroke of conservatives in America is that socialists just want everyone to be poor.
Yeah. Do you think that's true?
No, I don't. I don't think that's true at all. Elon Musk's wealth could solve literally every problem in the world. I think the UN's food insecurity team recently stated that 2% of his wealth would solve world hunger. So when you have people like that, it seems like the capitalists want people to be poor, right? Not the socialists.
Yeah, that feels certainly true to me. I think that what's key about this, socialism not being a poverty cult, is that you can be rich. You know, what we as socialists want is for people to own their work, right? You want to work for an organization where you own that labor, you get back as much labor value as possible, as opposed to a capitalist system where someone else owns your labor, in effect, and then pays you a small proportion of the value you make back. This isn't a controversial thing. This is just how everyone knows that jobs work, right? Like, you make more for your boss than you get back, or else they wouldn't hire you.
Yep.
And that is, in a sense, going to be true in a cooperative system as well, because some money will have to go to keeping the lights on, business development,
advertising, etc.
Advertising, pensions, whatever, you know. But the point is that you have more sort of democratic control over how that money is spent, and a higher proportion of that value is returned to you. So if you have a job where you produce a lot of value, you can get paid a lot. Don't have a problem with that. It's just about whether you make your money from working or from owning.
Well, lest we forget that one of the co-authors of the Communist Manifesto was a very wealthy business owner.
That is true. Frederick Engels, Marxist sugar daddy. Any other misconceptions that come to mind before we move on?
I just think we want to reiterate that capitalism and commerce are not the same. That we are not trying to advocate for the end of money. Well, maybe Adam will, and if it work, if the revolution works, and in way down the line. But no, in general, leftists are not advocating for the end of money, the end of commerce. In our society that we envision, you can still go buy a cheeseburger, right? The buying and selling of things continues still.
Yeah. Markets are not inherent to capitalism.
No, they've existed pretty much since society has been around, and capitalism was not around back then. So.
No, capitalism, 1602. Took a while to spread across the world after that, but boy did it run with it. So, maybe we can chat a little bit about some of the successes of socialism, some examples of socialist countries where these policies, these broad social welfare policies, have had some big benefits. And for this, I have 3 examples. Cuba, the USSR, and Chile under Allende. What do you know about Cuba?
So Cuba, being a very close neighbor of the United States, was under their thumb for quite a while. It used to be owned by the United States, actually, but eventually when it got its independence, it was under a very capitalist dictatorship, a fascist one pretty much, if you want to look at how it actually ran. This was under Batista, and I know that in 59? Am I getting that correctly?
I think so.
Around that time, there was a communist revolution in Cuba, and ever since then, they have been isolated from the rest of the world largely by an embargo placed by the U.S. Navy. But I do also know that despite this, there have still been some success stories from Cuba, despite being shut off from the world at large.
So, as you say, the U.S. absolutely imposed this massive blockade on Cuba. Fidel Castro, who was for many years the leader of Cuba, was not particularly a socialist at the beginning, not a communist really. He just wanted freedom for Cuba, and he was open to whatever political sort of persuasion would allow him to do that. It just so happens that the US wanted to exert massive control over the island that he wasn't willing to accept, and so that pushed him further to the left. Che Guevara, on the other hand, was always a communist, a very committed one. So Cuba, they are massively successful in healthcare. Before the Cuban Revolution, 1959, they had 3 medical schools, and only wealthy people were able to go to these medical schools because they were very expensive. Now, there are 23 medical schools in Cuba. They train locals for free, and they train internationals free of charge. Lots of people from poorer countries in the world become doctors as a result of Cuban training. They have a super high doctor-to-patient ratio. There are more than 8 doctors for every 1,000 citizens.
Wow.
And there is good healthcare coverage across the island in more rural areas because as a part of your training, you have to spend, it's either a year or 2, I can't remember, in a rural area acting as that village doctor, and they cycle through like there. So even rural areas have access to doctors. They have a lower infant mortality rate than, for example, the United States. They have 4 infant deaths for every 1,000 births, as opposed to 5.7 infant deaths for every 1,000 births in the US.
I'm sure that disparity will grow in the coming years based on some policies.
Unfortunately, that is probably true. All Cubans get at least 1 annual visit from the doctor, depending on risk factors, more if they are at a higher risk, and that's even true if they live rurally, as mentioned. They have excellent record on women's rights. They have the second highest female representation in the main governing body as of 2019, which is when this data is from. 53% women in their government, as opposed to the US, which is ranked 77th and had 23% women, again of 2019, when this article was from. They were the first to sign and second to ratify the UN Discrimination Against Women Convention, which was signed, though not ratified, by the US. And finally, for this example, they have a super high literacy rate, 99% literacy rate, free education from primary school through to university. And this was something which was not always true. In 1961, Che Guevara organized these literacy brigades, which were sent out all over the island and taught 700,000 adults how to read. It is one of the most successful education programs in history.
And to dispel some more myths that you might hear in the West, particularly in the US, about Cuba, and this is true of many immigrant groups to countries where the US had a play in the history in the past, maybe with Britain as well in the UK. But for example, many people fled Cuba after the revolution, and this was not because of some of the stories they tell. It's not due to the oppression of the communist regime. It was the oppression of the communist regime against them because they were capital owners who were exploiting people and vastly benefited from Batista's dictatorship. So these were the people that came over to the US because they were aiding the dictatorship. But the generations since, their families tell these stories, these horror stories about Cuba. And likewise, there are a lot of Vietnamese in California, and they have a similar feeling about like Ho Chi Minh and his party in Vietnam, and it's because they were aiding the U.S. in the oppression of Vietnamese people. So it's just worth knowing that sometimes stories told in the UK or the US are not necessarily representative of the entire population. It might be that those people came to those countries for a reason. Sometimes it was because they were contributing to the oppressive regimes that came before.
That's very true, and I think that is very true in terms of people from the former Soviet Union that, at least that I'm likely to meet in Western Europe, and probably that you're likely to meet in the States, which these are people who maybe were wealthy before, or maybe became wealthy since 91, the collapse of the USSR, which is the minority. More wealth entered Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union, but inequality skyrocketed. So rich people in Russia are better off than they were during the Soviet Union. Poor people are significantly worse off.
Oh, yeah. And I guess just a cap on my previous note, Imagine an American or a British person living in China today and thriving there, what they might say about the US or the UK. That's kind of what I mean about reasons for immigration. The people moving to a place are obviously going to have a great view of that place and a probably unfavorable view of the place they left.
Yeah, for sure. And it is the case that capitalist systems can be very damaging. Life expectancy in the Russian Federation did not meet that of the USSR until 2015, so more than 25 years after, give or take. They obviously won the space race. They are the only major country that were not affected by the Great Depression. Their economy was booming during the Great Depression.
And a note on that space race. The fact that the USSR went from feudalism to Sputnik in about 50 years is maybe one of the most insane statistics in all of history.
Well, this is the last point that I have on them, which is about their rapid industrialization. According to Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny, two academics, no society increased living standards as rapidly. In 50 years, they went from 12% of the industrial production of the US to 80%, and 85% of the agricultural output. Massive boom in economy. Wow. The final example I have is an interesting one because this is where the US was very effectively able to intervene. The US tried to intervene in Cuba, many times tried to kill Fidel Castro. They had all sorts of hands in the Soviet Union, but ultimately, well, they didn't directly depose any leaders there. But in Chile, they did. Salvador Allende was elected in 1971. He was a socialist. He developed a system called CyberSign. This was a computer system in 1971 that showed how goods should be distributed across the country as with the aid of various models, mathematics, so that the newly nationalized industries would have the resources they need. In the first year of this nationalized industry with this CyberSign system, GDP rose by 7.7% and production was increased 13.7%. Very successful, and Allende was brought down in a CIA-backed coup in 1973, leading to the fascist government of Pinochet. Maybe fascism is the wrong term, but certainly right-wing dictatorship.
I think you can put it in the fascist category.
So these are some successes of socialist states over the years. Now, this all sounds great for most people, but there are certain moneyed interests that sort of don't want this to happen. These are the interests that are in power. There are ideological differences, as there always were, between the sort of capitalist nations that emerged out of the imperialist European and American powers and the sort of socialist nations on the left. The crisis that we face today was created by a direct response to the socialist threat, which is neoliberalism. We mentioned liberalism a little bit, but how does that distinguish from neoliberalism?
Liberalism, as we say, kind of refers to the classic model of it. This is the ideals that you see in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, freedom of the individual, and freedom to pursue those enterprises of the free market. I think neoliberalism is an elevation of those freedoms, but to companies as a whole. I'm thinking of like Citizens United, which came in 2011, I think, in the US, 2010, around then. This basically made it so that corporations, in the eyes of politics, were given the same rights as people in America.
Yeah.
And they were, in this way, there were no caps put on the amount of money they could donate to politicians.
So that's part of it. Neoliberalism differs from liberalism in the sense that classical liberalism was about freedom in an economic sphere, but an economic sphere that was seen as not all-encompassing. It was like a distinct area of life that was separate from maybe social programs or personal liberties in some way. Neoliberalism was about the marketization of all aspects of life, and particularly a massive deregulation. So the idea being that businesses should be allowed to do whatever they want. The market will regulate itself is this idea. And also the privatization of national industries. There's this idea that government is always less efficient than private industry. And so you've got to sell it all off. You've got to make all the energy, the rail network, the water, the post office.
And I would like to say as well, we've alluded to this throughout, But I think the biggest problem here is that neoliberalism cannot handle crisis. And as you were talking about those days of 2001 to 2008, it seemed fine, right? The 90s as well in places like Britain and the US seemed very prosperous, and there were inequalities, but overall GDP going way up, and, quality of life people thought was going way up. But neoliberalism cannot handle when crisis hits. And in history, we've seen that in the face of adversity, liberal democracies either turn towards socialism or turn towards fascism to solve their problems. You can even see that in World War II and the Great Depression. So how did Germany and Italy react to the Great Depression? It was the rise of fascism. How did America tackle it? It was actually socialism at the time. And that was how they were tackling those independent
socialistic for sure, like the New Deal, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all of the policies that are seen as the norm now, Social Security, the highway infrastructure, works programs, different things that we take for granted in the U.S. now were put in place at that time to combat the hardships of the Great Depression.
Let's talk about that. You mentioned Nazi Germany, you mentioned Italy under Mussolini. What do you know about how these fascist states came about?
I mean, it was crisis, right? After World War I, Germany was essentially blamed for the whole conflict, and in the treaties signed with the US, the UK, France, they had to pay immense reparations for the war. It can be argued whether or not that was justified. I mean, they didn't start the war, but they were a big player in it. And this led to a puppet sort of government. The Weimar Republic had no teeth and was kind of at the whim of the West. And a lot of Germans had a problem with that because inflation was going crazy. There are some anecdotes you can look up about something about bringing a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. And this led to the Nazi Party rising in Germany, promising prosperity once again, vengeance basically against the West, and massive industrialization to rebuild Germany. But the important part about their ideology was that it created an in-group and an out-group. So, the Aryan nation, the white Germans were the in-group, and everyone else, including even white Germans that were communists or socialists, were the out-group, and they were the problem within society. They were the ones impeding progress.
And this is important as someone to blame. Right? The idea is,
right, exactly.
If you don't have this systemic approach to things where you're like, the system is broken and we need to change it, then if the system's fine, someone must be sabotaging it. And in Nazi Germany, that was socialists, communists, trade unionists. Those are the first three lines of the poem. Jews, most famously, gay people, the Roma, the Sinti, all of anyone who could be considered an outsider to the white Aryan race.
Even like Czech people.
Yeah.
Who are like as almost German as it gets.
And in Italy, it was similar. Italy was also punished under the Treaty of Versailles. It may have been a different treaty, actually. There were several treaties that went on, but a post-World War I treaty. Mussolini was utterly destroyed in the 1919 election. He received just a few thousand votes to the several million that socialists won in Italy. So he made these personal deals with industrialists, landowners, businessmen who had a lot to lose from the rise of socialism in order to basically beat up and murder labor leaders with their financial backing. The Italian government at the time also was not a fan of socialists, so largely let that happen. And here is another key reason why liberalism cannot defeat fascism, which is fascism is not a threat to capital. So capital owners will always side with fascists over socialists in the event of a crisis.
I mean, that's kind of evident today with the richest man on earth being a pretty open Nazi nowadays.
Yeah, pretty open Nazi, and also senior advisor to the President of the United States. Sam, what's the alternative? How do we get out of this mess? Can we get out of it?
Well, I think there are alternatives. I often feel like we're living in one of the worst timelines as to how human organization could be. There were many alternatives, but in order to pivot from where we are now, I think there's one glaring one, and that is what we've been talking about this whole time, leftism, right? And I think leftism, without all of the little camps, right? I think at this point in time, we're in a crisis of a huge magnitude. And I think anyone that opposes fascism and neoliberal like austerity needs to come together for that. And we can argue about the differences later on.
So I think there are certain things that we need to advocate for, as we do, that will help to pave the way for this. One of them is workplace democracy. We like to think we live in democracies, but most of our lives are not spent in them. So we want workers to have a say in the productive capacity of their jobs, not just CEOs and shareholders. There are advantages to this, even outside of an ideological framework. And the example I like to give is of my friend Sena, who works for a company called Arup. Arup is a big civil engineering firm that is employee-owned. And the reason this came up is because I had a working theory for a long time that everyone, no matter whether they work for the public sector, private sector, third sector, everyone thinks that their workplace is a shambles. It is horribly run, managements are idiots, they don't know what they're doing, etc., 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 right? I think everyone I meet feels that way. The exception is Signa. And she pointed out that she believes this is because, and she's not a particular leftist, she does not that interested in politics, but she believes it is because of their ownership structure where the board is elected by the employees of the company. It's usually someone who knows the company well, has been there a long time, and everyone gets a say in what goes on. There is profit sharing between all of the employees there. Very successful example of a cooperative run company. They are not inefficient, as some more conservative economists say. And an example of that I'd like to share is a very big cooperative, a network of cooperatives even, which is called Mondragon, which is based in Spain. They have subsidiaries in China, Germany, Mexico. I learned about this from Kim Stanley Robinson's amazing book, Ministry for the Future. But here is a quote about Mondragon from The New Yorker, an article written by Nick Romeo. Could you read that out, Sam?
When individual cooperatives do well, their members share in the profits. When times are hard, the cooperatives collectively support one another, sharing funds and reallocating workers among themselves to preserve jobs. During the pandemic, workers at many Mondragon co-ops voted to temporarily reduce their own salaries or hours until markets recovered. People who felt sick were trusted and encouraged to stay at home. The treatment of Hernandez said he received when he was fired would be almost impossible within Mondragon, since worker owners must vote to dismiss one another, and this can occur only in the cases of very severe misconduct.
Hernandez was a character mentioned earlier in the article about how he was sacked during the pandemic. So in Mondragon, it's a voluntary association of 95 autonomous cooperatives. Each executive of the cooperative makes 6 times the salary of the lowest paid employee, no more. There are no outside shareholders. You become an owner of the company, a member owner. Not immediately. This is not a system that is entirely open to abuse. You first have a temporary contract in which you prove yourself, prove you're capable, able to be a part of the company, and then after the temporary contract, you become a worker owner of the company. There's a CEO, kind of. There's like a managing director, but major decisions get a vote.
Sounds like his life is pretty easy.
Yeah, exactly. He basically chairs meetings and things like that.
Yeah.
Mondragon employs 80,000 people, 76% of which are owners. They have divisions in manufacturing, education, consulting. They have like a McKinsey-like consulting firm. And their revenue in 2021 was 11 billion euros. So pretty successful, pretty big company. This is a model that we can advocate for.
Yeah.
And beyond the sort of workplace dynamic of it, there is the national dynamic, right? The socialization of housing, healthcare, education. These should be human rights, not commodities. Public control of energy, transportation, healthcare. These should not be profit-driven. There are 2 kind of areas to look at why for this. There is the moral argument and the economic argument. The moral argument might be the easier one, so maybe you could start us off with the moral argument for the socialization of these industries.
I think it's the easy one, but it's also the one maybe capitalist supporters would be the least caring of. The moral argument would be that if there is a way to uplift our fellow humans, then we should take it. That it is selfish to pursue our own individual wealth while letting others starve and others fall by the wayside. So it's a moral organization to structure society in a socialist way.
Yeah, I think that is true, ensuring that people are cared for, have the things they need, etc. I think that if you agree that that's a good thing, then socialism seems like a good thing.
But I think there is also a more selfish way you
Mm-hmm.
can advocate for socialism, and I think that is very important, because at the end of the day, many business owners don't care about the moral argument. So what can you tell us about the economic argument for organizing this way?
Well, the economic argument is that it's more efficient in many instances. There are certain productive forces in society that it either doesn't make sense for them to compete with one another, or they are in themselves productive forces, so sharing this burden means that people can benefit from that across all of society, or a mixture of all of these things. For example, take transportation, take the rail network. There's only one set of tracks. Water, there's only one set of pipes. How are water companies going to compete with each other with this infrastructure that they are incentivized through the structure of organization to not maintain? Right, as little as money as possible should be invested in the maintenance of this, because more has to be siphoned off to shareholders. Thames Water in the UK, which is the private water company that manages London and much of the southeast of England, they've paid billions of pounds since the privatisation to shareholders, and yet Britain's water infrastructure is in a completely dilapidated state. We could have paid the same bills and invested this money into a water system that actually works. Things like healthcare. It's very inefficient to have people pay for healthcare, because if people are sick, they cannot work. They cannot make you more money. Well, maybe they can. Depends how sick you are and how vicious your boss is. But sick people shouldn't work, right? It can make more people sick. It can damage productive capacity of people who work there. And by making healthcare private, something that people have to pay for, that limits the number of people who can access this healthcare. Mr. Beast, for example.
Did he buy a hospital? Is that what you're saying?
No, this was a different video. I did not expect myself to reference Mr. Beast, but here we are. He made a video ages ago. He gave 10,000 blind people sight, or 1,000 people blind people sight or something, with a very simple operation, but it cost $10,000 in the US. So all of these people didn't have it. And even he is an arch capitalist, right? He will likely be the first social media billionaire. Mm-hmm. But even he was watching this. He's like, yeah, I don't get why the government doesn't pay for this, because this is like a 15-minute procedure and then all of these people can go to work. It would make a ton of money.
Yeah.
And some things just only work at scale. Like, an example that I think is really kind of fun of this is to do with energy. And there are big projects in California, actually, of how to harness solar energy in terms of a battery, where you take solar power at midday when there's way too much of it, more than is needed in California. You use that energy to pump water up a mountain into a dam, and then at night you switch the generator around, so the pump becomes a generator, water flows back down, and hydroelectricity is produced in that way, right? It's a really clever way of preserving this solar energy, and it's pretty efficient. Only about 20% of the energy is lost in this way, so it's really like great sustainable green energy. Mm-hmm. I watched a video of a guy who is a really cute YouTube channel. He's like a dad that does these little DIY projects with his kids, and he built one of these on his house, and he spent all day a little solar panel pumping water up from a barrel, and then at night letting it fall down, and it was enough to power a small LED light bulb for about 5 minutes. So these things only work at scale in some instances.
Yeah.
So that's the economic argument. Basically, it's more efficient, it allows for greater productivity, and it stops competition in areas where it simply is not productive for it to happen. And this brings us right back to our sort of raison d'etre, the purpose of our podcast, which is protest.
Which I don't think... Maybe at this point people are like, what does this have to do with protest, guys?
Well, why don't you tell us? What does this have to do with protest?
Well, I mean, we do live in where none of this is being implemented. None of these solutions that we see are here, and life will continue to get worse under the current measures. And if the US and the UK and Europe as a whole stays the course of what they're on, there's going to be more protest and potentially revolution one day.
Yeah.
So the point of us being here is maybe we can provide some of that terminology, provide some of that background, some of these strategies for when that time comes, and maybe someone listening will be that leader one day. It definitely won't be us. But
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important to remember that the ruling class never relinquishes power willingly. Every big step in society, and in many of the regressions have been the result of struggle, organization, marches, often violent uprisings, but, that's not what we're advocating for here.
The only time in history I can even think of something to that effect is when Malaysia kicked Singapore out for being too rich and powerful. And they said, you guys go be your own country because we want to do our own thing without you outshining us.
I didn't know that.
It happened.
That's very funny.
Singapore was in Malaysia for 2 years.
Oh, interesting. Well, any example you can pick, any former colonial struggle, any civil rights advancement, any labor rights advancement has been the result of long struggle. Just to say that you have to demand what you want or else you won't get it.
Absolutely.
And it's important to remember also that protests are the most effective when they disrupt the economy and the sort of neoliberal capitalist profit-driven structure. The most effective way is a general strike. There was an example of this in Greece just recently, this weekend even, as a protest against inaction for a train crash that happened 2 years ago. You shut down the productive capacity. The workers' biggest power is their ability to withhold labour, which is why unions are so important. You should join your union.
We'll have to dive into that Greece one episode.
We will.
Because there are some very confusing narratives around it floating around.
There for sure are. And alongside that, you need to build the structures to support this work as well. Mutual aid networks, groups of people who you can organise with and go to these protests. Make sure that everyone has the ability to make their voice heard. Protest isn't just about visibility. It's about making the system that we live in ungovernable until our demands are met.
100%. And as we've talked about in other episodes thus far, it's about finding your role in this movement as well. Where can your expertise and experience lend yourself to your community in this resistance?
Also, to bear in mind, I think that what is a really liberal idea, maybe a neoliberal idea, is maybe not ever explicitly said, but is certainly the vibe, which is that politics is something that happens once every 4 or 5 years. At the polling booth. I think it's important to remember that politics is something that happens every day. Elections are great, sure, the vote, absolutely, it's very important, but that should not, if at all possible, be the be-all and end-all of your political engagement, because you'll be very disappointed with what happens and changes if you rely exclusively on this structure.
And I will say this as well, that to be a leftist is not an abandonment of your liberal ideals. In fact, I would say that I am a leftist today because I believe in classical liberal ideals. Think the American Revolution and the Enlightenment. I do believe that all men and women are created equal, and I believe in a lot of those ideas that were where the pen was put to paper in the U.S. 250 years ago. Now, at the time, these didn't apply to everyone, but I believe that they do, and I see socialism and leftism as the way to manifest these classical Enlightenment ideas and actually liberate our society and create a better life for everyone.
Maybe this is the point where we wrap things up. I think we've been through an awful lot, and I hope that we have convinced people that not only is the left not scary and not going to take away your liberties, but is a way to a freer, more prosperous future for you. And if that has been convincing to you, hopefully we can help you out with your journey, get organised, develop mutual aid networks, legal funds, solidarity, etc. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up here, Sam?
Well, that's the preseason, so thank you for learning with us. And I think we'll look back on some of these episodes in a few years' time and see that we've learned so much since now. Come on that ride with us. And hopefully we'll see you out there at some protest movements one day. But yeah, from here on out, it's our regularly scheduled programming. So I hope that this preseason has been helpful for some people. Feel free to share some of these episodes with your friends if you have these ideas and maybe just don't know the right way to explain them. And friends have an hour on their hands to hear us out.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening. Look after each other and keep fighting the good fight. To take us home, Sam, would you read out this quote from legendary leftist, feminist, sci-fi author Ursula K. Le Guin?
We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings.